Tomorrow at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, RoughRider officially launches at roughriderusa.co. RoughRider is a brand that me and two of my really close friends have been building for a year. It's American-made, American classics with a Western touch. We've worked very hard, sourced many fabrics, many manufacturers, many samples to get to what we feel is the best, most rugged denim button-up that you can buy. And I want to speak a little bit about that before today's episode, because today's episode is on the RoughRider Regiment that Teddy Roosevelt and Leonard Wood led in the Spanish-American War. And it is in their same spirit, and then as an ode to them and the spirit with which they fought, that we created this brand and hope that this brand resonates with. When we first set out to make something in America, firstly, it was much more difficult than we realized. We thought it would be relatively simple. You just find a manufacturer, find some sourcing, and then you put it together. It took us a significantly longer time than we thought it would, more expensive than we thought it would be, but we could not be more pleased with the journey, with our partners and who we're working with the final product. As you can see that I'm wearing right now, it's a fantastic button-up. It's exactly what we hoped it would be. And as it relates to the actual mission and the story that we're trying to tell with this brand, we basically, the impetus was me and my two co-founders, we wear Western style apparel. You've got all these big name brands, and they're great clothes, they're great brands, but we realized that all of them are espousing these American values and sort of this Americana style, but they're not made in America, which didn't sit right with us. So we searched for it, wasn't there. We decided to make it and build it and criticize by creating, as my friend Noah Heisman says. So we built it. We made an American-made, Western-style button-up to start. This is called the Roosevelt. As you can see, and as you will see on social media, and if you go to the website, there's slight Western touches. But the spirit of this shirt and what we hope to impart on people or embolden people that wear the shirt to live by is the spirit of the RoughRider, the volunteer regiment led by Leonard Wood and Teddy Roosevelt, as I said. These guys were, and we'll get into more details here in a minute, but these guys were from all over the country. Volunteers. You had guys from Harvard, aristocratic, wealthy families in the East, from the Southeast, star athletes at Yale and Princeton. And then you had frontiersmen, hunters, cowboys, Indians from the West that had never been east of Texas, let alone the Mississippi, who had ridden horses, shot guns, hunted for their livelihood, for their entire lives, who had never been in a town bigger than a regular old cow town. And so you had all these people from different varying backgrounds that decided voluntarily to come together and fight for the American ideal, the ideal that is freedom, that is unadulterated, pure red, white, and blue freedom. And they were united by that spirit, and they decided to volunteer, put their lives on the line. Many of them did die. Most of them bled and were injured, and all of them sacrificed greatly. As I mentioned again, because it's so important, as volunteers. They were not regular army men. They volunteered to come to this regiment and serve, unified by the spirit, the American spirit. And that's what we hope to embolden people that wear RoughRider to live by, that same spirit, because we believe that there's a renaissance coming around. There's this awakening, this great revival in America for pro-American sentiments, and the idea that the pride in being American and being a part of this nation that's lifted more people out of poverty than any nation or civilization in the history of mankind. The nation that's won 2 world wars. The nation that's conquered a vast and entire continent. It's a powerful sentiment, and we hope that you wear this shirt with that same spirit being lived and breathed by you as well. So with that said, you can get yours tomorrow. Actually, this will release today. So today at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time at RoughRiderUSA.com. This is not a lot of shirts. It's a limited launch. I hope you like it. I hope that you wear it proudly and revive that American spirit as we are trying to do. With that said, to the Rough Riders. Teddy Roosevelt was, I believe, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy when the Spanish-American War. He had been preparing and had sort of assumed that the war with Spain was going to happen. There was some conflicts in Cuba. It was kind of amounting to this inevitable military conflict. One thing to note about him, I'm going to be pulling from his book that he wrote called The Rough Riders, and then also The Rise of Teddy Roosevelt by Edmund Morris, which is a biography. He says in his book, to the book, from the beginning, I had determined that if a war came, somehow or other, I was going to the front. To the Edmund Morris biography, I say quite sincerely that I shall not go for my own pleasure. On the contrary, if I should consult purely my own feelings, I should earnestly hope that we would have peace. I like life very much. I have always led a joyous life. I like thought and I like action. And it will be very bitter to me to leave my wife and children. And while I think I could face death with dignity, I have no desire before my time has come to go out into the everlasting darkness. So I shall not go into war with any undue exhilaration of spirits or in a frame in any way approaching recklessness or levity. But my best work here is done. One of the commonest taunts directed at men like myself is that we are armchair and parlor jingoes who wish to see others do what we only advocate doing. I care very little for such a taunt, except as it affects my usefulness. But I cannot afford to disregard the fact that my power for good, whatever it may be, would be gone if I didn't try to live up to the doctrines I have tried to preach. So he's a politician at this point, living in Washington, D.C. He has power. He actually is Assistant Secretary of the Navy, so he has power to send young men into battle. And there's this old adage that says, all wars are fought by boys. And I think there maybe even is a second part to that, but waged by men, something like that. He didn't want to be one of those armchair jingos, as he said, where he's sending these young men and boys to die without ever having to experience or face what they faced as well. So it was very important to him, very, very important to him to live up to those ideals and actually act on them. Another note, his father essentially dodged the Civil War. And it was his father's one of his greatest regrets in life. He actually paid for somebody to go in his stead, which was a common practice for wealthy people back then. But either way, his father regretted it throughout his life. And Teddy Roosevelt was like the only blemish on Teddy Roosevelt's father's otherwise pristine armor in the eyes of Teddy. He wished very greatly that was not the case, and he hoped and sought to sort of rectify what he believed to be the only shortcoming, or the only prominent shortcoming of his father's life. That said, he wanted to go to the front. He said, somehow or another, I was going to the front, which is important because, like I said, he didn't have to go to war. He had a job. He used every connection he levered. He used every lever he could to get himself in a position where he could be in a leadership position in the war, and it came to fruition. So another thing that I think is important is his humility. So he was a very well-known guy, liked by a lot of people, had Assistant Secretary of Navy background, a lot of connections. So he actually got offered the colonel seat, which would have led the entire regiment. But to the book, here's a little bit about the origin and Teddy Roosevelt's humility in leadership. Secretary Alger offered me the command of one of these regiments. If I had taken it, being entirely inexperienced in military work, I should not have known how to get it equipped most rapidly, for I should have spent valuable weeks in learning its needs, with the result that I should have missed the Santiago campaign and might not have even had the consolation prize of going to Puerto Rico. Fortunately, I was wise enough to tell the secretary that while I believed I could learn to command the regiment in a month, that it was just this very month which I could not afford to spare, and that therefore I would be quite content to go as lieutenant colonel if he would make Leonard Wood colonel. This was entirely satisfactory to both the president and the secretary, and accordingly, Wood and I were speedily commissioned as colonel and lieutenant colonel of the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry. This was the official title of the regiment, but for some reason or another, the public promptly christened us the Rough Riders. So he could have been the leader. He could have been the guy to have all this fame and prominency and all this stuff, but he understood his limitations, and he had the humility to take a step back and say, you know what? As long as Leonard Wood, a man that I respect, admire, who had leadership experience in the military and military campaigns, as long as he's the colonel, I will gladly serve under him. So he made himself subservient, which I think is a powerful indication of the type of leader he was, and also a good lesson for us in terms of leadership. He could have very well just taken that for himself. But there he is, Lieutenant Colonel with Leonard Wood as the colonel. I spoke a little bit about who they were and who these men were. I want to speak on that a little bit more. To the book. We drew recruits from Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and many other colleges, from clubs like Somerset of Boston and Knickerbocker of New York, and from among the men who belonged neither to club nor to college, but in those veins, in whose veins the blood stirred with the same impulse which once set the Vikings over sea. So they're getting these guys from Harvard and all this stuff, but they're also getting these guys from the West. One thing to note, actually, so he was from Harvard. He went to Harvard, so it was alumni. When people found out that they were raising this volunteer cavalry regiment, which basically meant horseback. Cavalry was the men that rode on horses. That's why they're called the RoughRiders. When the people realized that they were putting together this regiment, they were swarmed, overwhelmed with applications and people asking favors to get into the regiment and so on and so forth. They had to turn down a ton of people, which I think also just speaks to the spirit of the country and the men that lived here back then. They were eager to do the fighting and the bidding of the nation, so much so that they had to turn away people from a volunteer regiment, which is pretty crazy. So, to the book about these Harvard guys. Harvard being my own college, I had such a swarm of applications from it that I could not take 1 in 10. What particularly pleased me, not only in the Harvard, but Yale and Princeton men, and indeed in these recruits from the older states generally, was that they did not ask for commissions. With hardly an exception, they entered upon their duties as troopers in the spirit which they held to the end, merely endeavoring to show that no work could be too hard, too disagreeable, or too dangerous for them to perform, and neither asking nor receiving any reward in the way of promotion or consideration. They just wanted to serve. These men were from wealthy aristocratic families, many of them, wealthy backgrounds, influential backgrounds, and they did not ask for commissions. They didn't ask for pay raises. They didn't ask for recognition. They just wanted to do their duty as American men and soldiers in the American Army, which, incredible. Indeed, they all sought entry into the ranks of the Rough Riders as eagerly as if it meant something wildly different from hard work, rough fare, and the possibility of death. And the reason why they turned out to be such good soldiers lay largely in the fact that they were men who had thoroughly counted the cost before entering, and who went into the regiment because they believed that this offered their best chance for seeing hard and dangerous service. They wanted it. They wanted this stuff badly. They wanted to be in the fight. They wanted to be in the thick of it. All these men knew that they were going to see battle, and they were totally fine with that. In fact, they preferred it, and that's why they entered. He goes into great depth about the like some of the individuals in the regiment. For example, this is a little bit about the Westerners. They were a splendid set of men. These Southwesterners, tall and sinewy, with resolute, weather-beaten faces and eyes that looked a man straight in the face without flinching. They included in their ranks men of every occupation, but the three types were those of the cowboy, the hunter, and the mining prospector, the man who wandered hither and thither, killing game for a living and spending his life in quest for metal wealth. So those are the three prominent occupations of the men from the Southwest, like New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, that general area. That was the occupation. That was the type of person that was coming to the regiment from those areas, which I think is telling. One of these men, named Alan Caprone, Teddy Roosevelt held him in a very, very high regard. A little bit about him. The note I wrote here was the ideal American. Finally, there was Alan Caprone, who was, on the whole, the best soldier in the regiment. In fact, I think he was the ideal of what an American regular Army officer should be. He was the fifth in descent from father to son who had served in the Army of the United States, and in body and mind alike, he was fitted to play his part to perfection. Tall and lithe, a remarkable boxer and walker, a first-class rider and shot, with yellow hair and piercing blue eyes, he looked what he was, the archetype of the fighting man. He had under him one of the two companies from the Indian Territory, and he so soon impressed himself upon the wild spirit of his followers that he got them ahead in discipline faster than any other troop in the regiment, while at the same time caring for their bodily wants. His ceaseless effort was to train them, care for them, and inspire them to bring their fighting efficiency to the highest of duty. But his mastery of his art was so thorough and his performance of his own duty so rigid that he won at once not merely their admiration, but that soldierly affection so readily given by the man in the ranks to the superior who cares for his men and leads them fearlessly in battle. So that was Alan Caprone. Just a little bit. He goes into depth, like I said, about a lot of these guys. These guys were just stand-up individuals. Teddy Roosevelt revered them and admired them and respected them and loved them greatly because of their temperaments and dispositions similar to Alan Caprone. This is awesome. So born adventurers is the note I have. All Easterners and Westerners, Northerners and Southerners, officers and men, cowboys and college graduates, wherever they came from and whatever their social position, possessed in common the traits of hardihood and a thirst for adventure. They were, to a man, born adventurers in the old sense of the word. So these men just wanted adventure. They wanted to explore. They wanted to test themselves. They wanted battle. They wanted fighting. They wanted all the things that you want out of a soldier. And that's why they were such a prominent and prolific fighting force as a volunteer regiment. And we'll get into what that actually looked like and how they were perceived by regular Army regiments and things of that sort. But just born adventurers. I love that idea. Being a born adventurer in the old sense of the word. Somebody who just wanted to test the limits, to adventure, to explore, to basically conquer novelty and to see what they're made of. It's fantastic. A little bit about another little sentence about what they were like and who they were. Above all, every man felt and had constantly instilled into him a keen pride of the regiment and a resolute purpose to do his whole duty uncomplainingly and above all to win glory by the way he handled himself in battle. This reminds me of part of the essay that I did by Ralph Waldo Emerson called Courage. He spoke about in the Civil War, young men who had never seen more tough fighting or competition than that of a baseball game, who went into battle and said, basically, I can die. I can very well die. Totally fine with that. Good to go. I can die. That's fine. But I cannot afford to misbehave. And by misbehave, he meant basically act cowardly. And that's the same thing with these guys. These guys would not let themselves do anything but perform their whole duty and win glory basically by how they handled themselves in the battlefield and in the face of opposition. So duty is a very important word in this book and in this regiment. It was one of their most primary focuses. And so here's a couple sentences about that. They were strapping fellows, entirely fearless, modest, and quiet. Their only thought was how to perfect themselves in their own duties and how to take care of the men under them so as to bring them to the highest point of soldierly perfection. They not merely did their duty, but were always on the watch to find out some new duty which they could construe to be theirs. Speaking of a guy named Greenway, he could have commanded any influence, social or political, he wished, but he never asked a favor of any kind. They all earnestly wished for a chance to distinguish themselves and fully appreciated that they ran the risk of not merely death, but of what was infinitely worse, namely, failure at the crisis to perform duty well, and they strove earnestly so to train themselves and the men under them as to minimize the possibility of such a disgrace. No excuse would be tolerated for failure to perform duty. So when you think of the word self-reliance, like that's what these guys live. They were as self-reliant as they could possibly be. They were as focused and determined to perform their whole duty in the crisis, in the face of opposition, at the boiling point, as you could possibly be. They were so focused on it. It was their number one focus, and that's what made them such good soldiers. I think that's also something we could take note of as well. Being dutiful. What does it mean? Like I heard this idea of like discipline or duty being doing what you need to do when you need to do it, whether you feel like doing it or not. And that's what these men did. They were hell-bent on becoming, as Teddy Roosevelt would call it, soldierly perfection. So when they were going to, they trained outside of San Antonio, and they were trained or transported via train to Tampa, where they were going to embark. And on the way, this is just an interesting take, because you think about the time, this is 1898, so only 40 years after the Civil War. They're going through these towns, and here to the book. Everywhere the people came out to greet us and cheer us. They brought us flowers, they brought us watermelons and other fruits, and sometimes jugs and pails of milk, all of which we greatly appreciated. We were traveling through a region where practically all of the older men had served in the Confederate Army, and where the younger men had all their lives long drunk in the endless tales told by their elders, at home and at the crossroad taverns and in the courthouse squares, about the cavalry of Forrest and Morgan and the infantry of Jackson and Hood. The blood of the old men stirred to the distant breath of battle. The blood of the young men leaped hot with eager desire to accompany us. The older women who remembered the dreadful misery of war, the misery that presses its iron weight most heavily on the wives and the little ones, looked sadly at us. But the young girls drove down in bevies, arrayed in their finery, to wave flags in farewell to the troopers and to beg cartridges and buttons as mementos. So it's just interesting going through these towns, the different generations, the different types of people, and how they perceive the war. The men, the old men who served in the Confederate Army in the Civil War, they were stirred. They were uneasy about the distant breath of battle. The young men who had yet to fight or didn't have the opportunity to fight yet were eager to join them. And the older women who had lived through the Confederacy and understood, as he said, that they understood the misery that presses its iron weight most heavily on them and the children. They understood that, and they were sort of apprehensive and sad for the soldiers going into battle. The young women who had not done that were almost infatuated. It was like stardom to them. They just wanted to have little mementos and to wish them well, which is just interesting, something to take note of. Old women are usually wise, so think about that. So they get to Tampa. Logistics are a little interesting. There's a lot of challenges going on with like who's going, how they're getting there. It's kind of every man for themselves. Not a lot of logistical competence in the U.S. military at this point. And so they actually end up having to leave part of the regiment back. And so he says a note on this. Of course, really, those that stayed were entitled to precisely as much honor as those that went. Each man was doing his duty, and much the hardest and most disagreeable duty was to stay. Credit should go with the performance of duty and not with what is very often the accident of glory. So he's saying these guys who stayed, they were following their duty, and they're just as much worthy of credit and honor as the men who followed their duty to battle. It's all about duty to him and to the other men of this regiment. It's interesting because you think, okay, well, I'm going to battle, I could die, yada, yada, yada. He's saying very, very convictedly that the worst duty was to stay behind. These men wanted battle. They wanted to fight. They wanted to see the bloody, gory heat of it all. They wanted it. So the men that stayed felt like they were missing out on the opportunity of a lifetime, and that's very tough. But he is commending them for following their duty or completing or accomplishing their duty. Hamilton Fish and then Alan Caprone. I already mentioned Caprone, but this is a little bit about two of these guys. I think he thinks that these were two of the best soldiers he was ever around. Hamilton Fish had already shown himself one of the best non-commissioned officers we had. A huge fellow of enormous strength and endurance and dauntless courage. He took naturally to a soldier's life. He never complained and never shirked any duty of any kind, while his power over his men was great. So good a sergeant had he made that Captain Caprone, who I already mentioned, Alan Caprone, keen to get the best men under him, took him when he left to Tampa, for Fish's troop remained behind. So he basically, interjecting, Fish was the non-commissioned officer of another troop that was one of those troops that got left in Tampa. Caprone realized that he was such a good leader that he took him away from his troop and put him in control of one of Caprone's troop that was going to battle. That's how competent he was. As we stood under the flickering blaze that night, I caught myself admiring the splendid bodily vigor of Caprone and Fish, the captain and the sergeant. Their frames seemed of steel to withstand all fatigue. They were flushed with health, and their eyes shone high resolve and fiery desire. Two finer types of the fighting men, two better representatives of the American soldier, there were not in the whole army. Caprone was going over his plans for the fight when we should meet the Spaniards on the morrow, Fish occasionally asking a question. They were both filled with eager longing to show their mettle, and both were rightly confident that if they lived, they would win honorable renown and would rise in their chosen profession. Within 12 hours, they were both dead. So, two of the best men he ever known, two of the best examples of American soldiers that he'd ever seen or believed existed. They got into battle, and they died almost immediately, which is sad. It's just a clear indication or example of war. You know, there's a saying somewhere in here when a couple good guys die, somebody looks at one of the guys in the regiment and says, basically reiterates a common phrase or aphorism out west in the cowboy world, and it says, many a good horse die. That's just the way it is. Many a good men die. Only the good die young. However you want to say it, but these two good men died within 12 hours of battle, which is very sad. So they get into battle with the Spanish, who are occupying Cuba, and essentially the goal of this war is to rid the Spanish influence, or the the European influence from the Western Hemisphere. America wanted to be in control of the Western Hemisphere. They wanted the Spanish influence out of it. And Cuba is obviously very close to America. Spain had control of Cuba. America went in there and wanted to dispel Spanish influence. I believe it all started from the sinking of a ship, if I'm not mistaken. So I believe Spain, I think it was the Maine, the USS Maine, I think. Something like that, off the coast of Florida or somewhere along those lines. Spain was found to be at fault at that. And then America declared war, and here we are. So the Spanish were occupying Cuba. So American soldiers shipped from Tampa in Florida to Cuba. They docked, met with little opposition. But the interesting thing about the Spanish is, at the time, smokeless gunpowder was not ubiquitous, is not what everybody used. And you can think, so if I'm shooting a gun that bam, and then a huge puff of white smoke shows up, makes it very evident where the shot's coming from, especially in the jungle where there is no smoke. You hear a shot, you look up and you see this huge puff of white smoke. It's like, okay, we're going to concentrate our fire there. They were using smokeless powder, which, as I said, was not common. Made it very difficult to see where they were shooting from, especially you can think they were in this jungle environment, this tropical jungle environment. A lot of cover, a lot of brush, a lot of plant and foliage. So these Spanish soldiers were very well hidden, shooting smokeless powder guns, Mausers, I believe. So it made it very difficult, very very tough. It's tough to fight an enemy that you can't see, and they experienced that firsthand. So this is a recurring theme. These guys get injured. A lot of them get injured. They just wanted to fight so bad. Here's a little insight into their temperament and who they were. After a while, I noticed blood coming out of Roland's side and discovered that he had been shot, although he did not seem to be taking any notice of it. He said the wound was only slight, but as I saw he had broken a rib, I told him to go to the rear to the hospital. After some grumbling, he went, but 15 minutes later, he was back on the firing line again and said he could not find the hospital, which I doubted. However, I then let him stay until the end of the fight. This guy just got shot and broke a rib, and he's bleeding, and Teddy Roosevelt's like, dude, you're shot. Holy cow, you broke a rib and you're bleeding a lot. And he's like, it's only slight. And then he goes and air quotes, looks for the hospital for 15 minutes, couldn't find it, and comes right back to the fight. Which is awesome, because there's more stories that we'll get into about that, but this is just the type of guys that these were. This is another life lesson. So he's sitting there, as I said, they don't have walkie-talkies. Military communication is very interesting. They're in an unknown territory with unknown geographical and topographical undulations and just varying geography. It wasn't like a very seamless attack, essentially. So there's all these moving parts, not a lot of infrastructure, not a lot of logistics going on, or efficient logistics going on. So here Teddy Roosevelt stood, unsure of what to do, to the book. I was still very much in the dark as to where the main body of the Spanish forces were, or exactly what lines the battle was following, and was very uncertain what I ought to do. But I knew it could not be wrong to go forward, and I thought I would find Wood and then see what he wished me to do. All that to say, the lesson there is, could not be wrong to go forward. When in doubt, take action. That was Teddy Roosevelt's life motto. He has this famous aphorism I've said many times: black care rarely sits behind the rider whose pace is fast enough. He said, I knew not where I was. I knew not where the main body was. I didn't know exactly what to do, but I knew it could not be wrong to go forward. And in the end, it ended up being the right choice. Lesson there is take action. When uncertain, take action. Could be the tiniest step ever, but just go forward, gain some positive momentum. This note says courage. Thomas Isbell, a half-breed Cherokee in the squad under Hamilton Fish, was among the first to shoot and be shot at. He was wounded no less than 7 times. The first wound was received by him 2 minutes after he had fired his first shot, the bullet going through his neck. The second hit him in the left thumb. The third struck near his right hip, passing entirely through the body. The fourth bullet, which was apparently from a Remington and not from a Mauser, went into his neck and lodged against the bone, being afterward cut out. The fifth bullet again hit his left hand. The sixth scraped his head, and the seventh his neck. He did not receive all of the wounds at the same time. Over half an hour elapsing between the first and the last. Up to receiving the last wound, he had he had declined to leave the firing line, but by that time he had lost so much blood that he had to be sent to the rear. The man's wiry toughness was as notable as his courage. Guy literally got shot 7 times over 30-minute period and did not go to the back. Like, he would not retreat or go to the rear or go to the hospital. You talk about courage and toughness. That's insane. People get a paper cut and go to the hospital now. This guy got shot 7 times in the neck, in the head, in the thumb, in the rib, in the hip. That's insane. And like I said, this is not the only story of this. So the book again, another note is truth is in the action. At the front, everyone behaved quite simply and took things as they came in a matter-of-course way. But there was doubtless, as is always the case, a good deal of panic and confusion in the rear where the wounded, the stragglers, a few of the packers, and 2 or 3 newspaper correspondents were. And in consequence, the first reports sent back to the coast were of the most alarming character, describing with minute inaccuracy how he had run into ambush, etc. The lesson there is truth is in the action. Truth is at the front. It's like a game of telephone. The people that are actually in the fight understand the fight, and then over and over and over again, as it passes through the bureaucracy and the different people and different levels, it becomes diluted. The truth becomes further away. If you want to know the truth, go to the action. And this also reminds me of Jeff Bezos, for example, would get on customer service. I think like every executive at Amazon had to spend a certain amount of time answering customer service calls to see what the problems at the front were, where the fighting and where the action was actually taking place. I believe his name's something Carey, Jim Casey maybe, the founder of UPS. He would stop UPS drivers that he saw on the street and just ask them, hey, what are like the problems you're facing? What's going on there? How is this going? The lesson there is go to the front, go to where the action is, not the back newspaper correspondents, people that are several degrees removed from the action. Go to the front, to the actual area where the fighting and the action is taking place if you want to know what is happening. Okay, so this is interesting. This just shows the type of leader that TR is. There was a regulation for some reason. He referred to it as a silly regulation that forbade his purchasing of canned vegetables, etc., except for the officers. Basically, logistics were a nightmare here. And at the front, as they moved inland further from the beachhead and where the back and all the resources, food, etc. were, it became harder and harder to get people on the front, the soldiers on the front, necessary food and supplies. So he went to the commissary, which I believe is where you just bought, where you got stuff, like food. And there was a regulation where you could only buy these types of things for officers. And there's a story in the book, in the TR biography, where he basically like went to the commissary and was like, hey, I need to buy these for my soldiers. And he's like, you can't. You can only buy them for the officers. And he's like, okay, I'll only buy them for the officers. So he would spend his own money over and over and over again on these things and say that he was giving them to his officers and then just give them to his soldiers, which I guess it's breaking a regulation, but intuitively and logically it makes sense, and his soldiers were better fighters for it, which is just funny. It's the type of leader he was, and it's why his men revered him and loved him so much, because he would spend his own money getting them food and the necessary supplies that they needed, which is powerful. Okay, so this is another story of courage and just how tough these guys were. One of the men I took with me on one of these trips was Sherman Bell, the former deputy marshal of Cripple Creek and Wells Fargo Express rider. In coming home with his load, though through a binding storm, he slipped and opened the old rupture. The agony was very great, and one of his comrades took his load. He himself, sometimes walking and sometimes crawling, got back to camp, where Dr. Church fixed him up with a spike bandage, but informed him that he would have to be sent back to the States when an ambulance came along. The ambulance did not come until the next day, which was the day before we marched to San Juan. It arrived after nightfall, and as soon as Bell heard it coming, he crawled out of the hospital tent into the jungle, where he laid all night, and the ambulance went off without him. The men shielded him just as schoolboys would shield a companion carrying his gun, belt, and bedding. While Bell kept out of sight until the column started, and then staggered along behind it, I found him the morning of the San Juan fight. He told me that he wanted to die fighting, if die he must, and I hadn't the heart to send him back. He did splendid service that day, and afterward in the trenches, though the rupture opened twice again, and on each occasion he was within a hair's breadth of death, he escaped and came back with us to the United States. What a savage. He creeped out of the hospital because they wanted to send him away from the fighting where he might actually die and take him back to the United States where he could be reunited with his friends, recuperate, all this stuff. And he snuck out, laid in the jungle, and then got back to fighting and performed his duty splendidly, as Teddy Roosevelt said it. That's the spirit of the Rough Riders. Like, that is what it means when I speak about the brand Rough Rider and just this regiment as a whole. That's the spirit that I'm talking about. They were like irrefutably savage, just resilient, no quitting them at all. Extremely admirable traits in my opinion. Okay, so this is a cool story, kind of sad, but kind of funny in a way. The most serious loss that I and the regiment could have suffered befell just before we charged. Bucky O'Neill was strolling up and down in the front of his men, smoking a cigarette, for he was inveterately addicted to this habit. He had a theory that an officer ought never to take cover, a theory which was, of course, wrong, though in a volunteer organization the officers should certainly expose themselves very fully simply for the effect of the men. Our regimental toast on the transport running, the officers may the war last until each is killed, wounded, or promoted. So basically that was like their joke. Like the officers, may the war last until each is killed, wounded, or promoted. He basically, it was a pervading idea, and especially in the volunteer organizations, that the officers should put themselves in more danger than the men. And in fact, in this war particularly, in many wars, that was the case, where they exposed themselves. And I think the mortality rate was significantly higher was significantly higher in the officers than in the regular soldiers. To the book. As O'Neill moved to and fro, his men begged him to lie down. So he's riding his horse in front of, like, they're getting shot at, and he's just riding his horse back and forth, smoking his cigarette. That's awesome. His men begged him to lie down, and one of the sergeants said, "Captain, a bullet is sure to hit you." O'Neill took a cigarette out of his mouth and, blowing out a cloud of smoke, laughed and said, "Sergeant, the Spanish bullet isn't made that will kill me." A little later, he discussed for a moment with one of the regular officers the direction from which the Spanish fire was coming. As he turned on his heel, a bullet struck him in the mouth, and came out the back of his head, so that even before he fell, his wild and gallant soul had gone out into the darkness. Slightly comic. I mean, obviously very, very, it's serious stuff. Like, he literally said, the Spanish bullet's not made that will kill me. And then moments later, he died, as Teddy Roosevelt said so articulately, his wild and gallant soul had gone out into the darkness before he fell. But that's just the type of guys these were. I mean, he literally was exposing him to fire just for the effect it had on his men, to show, hey, look, y'all are scared. That's great. We're getting fired at. I'm riding my horse smoking a cigarette. I am chilling right now. And as often is the case, good soldiers follow good leaders that expose themselves to danger. And it's tough that he died, but the effect was long-lasting and certainly helped his soldiers act more valiantly and bravely. So TR was almost shot as well. Here's a little note on that. A curious incident happened as I was getting the men started forward. Always when men have been lying down under cover for some time and are required to advance, there is a little hesitation, each looking to see whether the others are going forward. As I rode down the line, calling to the troopers to go forward, I came upon a man lying behind a little bush, and I ordered him to jump up. I do not think he understood that we were making a forward move, and he looked up at me for a moment with hesitation, and I again bade him rise, jeering him and saying, "Are you afraid to stand up when I am on horseback?" As I spoke, he suddenly fell forward on his face, a bullet having struck him and gone through him lengthwise. I supposed the bullet had been aimed at me. At any rate, I, who was on horseback in the open, was unhurt, and the man lying flat on the ground in the cover beside me was killed. There were several pairs of brothers with us. Of the two Nortons, one was killed. Of the two McCurdy's, one was wounded. So he's sitting here riding horseback, just like I just mentioned. The officers riding on horseback, exposing them to more fire, more danger than their men. And a bullet was aimed at him, and it happened to hit the guy that he was telling to get up and go. So sad, but that's just like destiny as well. Like TR, what would have happened to American history had TR been hit by that bullet? He would have never become president. Likely would have never become president, especially if he died. He might never have built the Panama Canal. A lot of things. The conservation efforts probably wouldn't have been manifested. So it's just crazy. Like your life can change in an instant, and the inflection points that we all experience are very interesting to think about. Gallant is a word that he uses a lot in reference to his soldiers and the men that he saw fighting. Among the many deeds of conspicuous gallantry performed, two, both to the credit of the 1st Cavalry, may be mentioned as examples of the others, not as exceptions. So he's saying these are examples of everything that happened, not exceptions to what happened. Sergeant Charles Carson, while close behind Captain Tutherley, the squadron commander, was hit by a shrapnel bullet. He continued on the line, firing until his arm grew numb, and then he refused to go to the rear. and devoted himself to taking care of the wounded, utterly unmoved by the heavy fire. Trooper Hugo Britton, when wounded, brought the regimental standard forward, waving it to and fro to cheer the men. So these are two guys that got shot and were injured that kept on their duty. One got shot, and when his arm grew too numb to actually shoot and fire, he would help other wounded people, even though himself was gravely wounded. The other guy, Trooper Hugo, when wounded, brought the regimental standard, which I believe is their flag. He brought it forward and started waving it as a way to like boost morale and get the guys to be cheerful and things like that. Just courageous and gallant, to say the least. This is about a guy named Captain Mills. The note is shot through the head. When near the summit, Captain Mills had been shot through the head, the bullet destroying the sight of one eye permanently and of the other temporarily. He would not go back or let any man assist him, sitting down where he was and waiting until one of the men brought him word that the hill was stormed. He got shot in the face, in the head, literally destroyed his eyesight in one eye permanently and one eye temporarily, and he wouldn't go back to the rear. He had to wait and see if they actually conquered or achieved their mission, which they did. So I keep saying it, these guys are incredible. Fast forwarding a little bit, a lot of chaos. Soldiers are unsure of where their leaders are, where their regiment are, so they're kind of intermingled. They're mixed. They're mixed in with other regiments, other leaders, so they're not really sure what's going on, what their plan is, what they're supposed to do. And so he basically sees a group of soldiers start to head to the back. He sees them trying to go to the back. This I could not allow, as it was depleting my line. So I jumped up and, walking a few yards to the rear, drew my revolver, halted the retreating soldiers, and called out to them that I appreciated the gallantry with which they had fought and would be sorry to hurt them, but that I should shoot the first man who on any pretense whatever went to the rear. My own men had all sat up and were watching my movements with utmost interest. So was Captain Howes. I ended my statement to the colored soldiers by saying, "Now, I shall be very sorry to hurt you, and you don't know whether or not I will keep my word, but my men can tell you that I always do." Whereupon my cowpunchers, hunters, and miners solemnly nodded their head and commented in chorus, exactly as if in a common opera. He always does. He always does. So here he is. He said, look, you don't know whether I'm going to keep my word, but I guarantee you I will. My men can attest to that. And then in unison, in like almost a comic chorus, all the men are like, he will, he will, he will. Don't go to the back, or he literally will shoot you, because he said he would, because his word was important to him. So the lesson there is just be a man of your word. Say what you're going to do what you're going to say. Don't let falsehoods come from your mouth. Be a man of your word. As I mentioned, they were a volunteer regiment. That can bring about a little bit of animosity or inequality in the perception of regular versus volunteer soldiers. Regulars can sometimes look on volunteers as like, oh, these guys are a little less than us. They're not as trained. They're not as competent, etc. Not the case for the RoughRiders. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but there's basically just this long part about how one of the leaders of the military basically said, hey, look, you guys are just as good as any of this, and you might as well be named the 11th United States Horse instead of the 1st Volunteer. So basically, you guys are as good as the regulars. You might as well be named that way as well. Just speaks to the leadership, number one, to be able to get them trained as quickly as they did and as competent as they were, but also the type of men they were. As I mentioned, these guys were cowpunchers, hunters, frontiersmen. They were the best riders of all. Like, they were incredible riders. They were already incredible shots because they had already been shooting and riding horses for their entire life in strenuous and tough circumstance. So just a nice, cool little nod to hear, hey, look, like, you guys are just as good as the regulars, even though you trained for a month before the war. Here's a little lesson. So they experienced like 2 or 3 battles, one in Santiago maybe, and then San Juan. I can't remember, but they experienced a couple battles, and then they were basically waiting it out because the Spanish had like a little truce going. And the note here is inaction. Each day we expected either to see the city surrender or to be told to begin fighting again. And toward the end, it grew so irksome that we would have welcomed even an assault in preference to further inaction. So it just speaks to the temperament of Teddy Roosevelt, the men who were in his regiment, and just the idea that inaction is bad. Idle hands are the devil's playground. It is better to be moving forward than to not be doing anything at all. So he was like, hey, look, we would rather do a frontal attack on a fortified enemy than just sit here anymore. Like, we gotta move. We gotta do something. And that sentiment was shared by the men as well. They would rather put their lives on the line to move forward than to just sit there and do nothing, which is a lesson for all of us as well. So the war ends, and they go to a place called Montauk. I believe that's somewhere in the Northeast, because there was yellow fever and malarial fever and all this stuff. So they had to do like a quarantine of sorts. And they go up to this place where they're kind of just chilling and hanging out. And this is, it's like I think they're there for like a month or so. And they basically, it's like their farewell, but they're still training. They're kind of just quarantining and all this stuff. And Teddy Roosevelt's basically like, hey, look, to the book. Yet after the time, they would find that they had, here we go. I told them how proud I was of them, but warned them not to think they could now go back and rest on their laurels, bidding them remember that though for 10 days or so the world would be willing to treat them as heroes, yet after that time they would find they had to get down to hard work just like everyone else, unless they were to be regarded as worthless do-nothings. So he's like, hey, look, you guys are you're heroic. They will treat you as heroes, but for a period of time, and that will come to an end, and you got to get down to work, and you got to actually work hard to get yourself to where you need to be and be a useful member of society again, which is important because nobody wants to be useless. And it was a good recommendation, and he said that most of them heeded that recommendation as well. I love this description of the men. Now, in all of these respects, and in others like them, the Rough Riders were the equals of the regulars. They were hardy, self-reliant, accustomed to shift for themselves in the open under very adverse circumstances. The two all-important qualifications for a cavalryman are riding and shooting, the modern cavalrymen being so often used dismounted as an infantryman. The average recruit requires a couple of years before he becomes proficient in horsemanship and marksmanship, but my men were already good shots and first-class riders when they came into the regiment. The differences as regards officers and non-commissioned officers between regulars and volunteers is usually very great, but in my regiment, keeping in view the material we had to handle, it was easy to develop non-commissioned officers out of the men who had been roundup foremen, ranch foremen, mining bosses, and the like. These men were intelligent and resolute. They knew they had a great deal to learn, and they set to work to learn it, while they were already accustomed to managing considerable interests, to obeying orders, and to taking care of others as well as themselves. It's phenomenal. This group of men was a prolific group of men from insanely hard and rough and rugged backgrounds that basically lent themselves to the soldier life. And that's why they were so prolific as a volunteer fighting force. They trained for a month together before they went to battle. He wrote, this is how the book ends, how Teddy Roosevelt's book ends. It's a letter from a school teacher, a female school teacher, a college school teacher that had a couple members of her class be selected for the regiment. My dear Colonel Roosevelt, I did not at once reply to your letter on September 23rd because I waited for a time to see if there should be need among any of our Rough Riders of the money you so kindly offered. Some of the boys are poor, and in one or two cases they seemed to me really needy, but they all said no. More than once I saw the tears come to their eyes at the thought of your care for them, as I told them of your letter. Did you hear any echoes of our Indian war whoops over your election? They were pretty loud. I was particularly exultant because my father was a New Yorker and I was educated in New York, even if I was born here. So far as I can learn, the boys are taking up the dropped threads of their lives as though they had never been away. Our two Rough Rider students, Meager and Gilmore, are doing well in their college work. I am sorry to tell you of the death of one of your most devoted troopers, Bert Holderman, who was here serving on the grand jury. He was stricken with meningitis in the jury room and died after 3 days of delirium. His father, who was twice wounded, 4 times taken prisoner, and fought in 32 battles of the Civil War, now old and feeble, survives him, and it was indeed pathetic to see his grief. Bert's mother, who is Cherokee, was raised in my grandfather's family. The words of the commendation which you wrote upon Bert's discharge are the greatest comfort to his friends. They wanted you to know of his death because he loved you so. I am planning to entertain all of the Rough Riders in the vicinity some evening during my holiday vacation. I mean to have no other guests, but only give them the opportunity for reminiscence. I regret that Bert's death makes one less. I had hoped to have them sooner, but our struggling young college salaries are necessarily small and duties arduous. I make a home for my widowed mother and an adopted Indian daughter who is in school, and as I do the cooking for a family of 5, I have found it impossible to do many things I would like to do. Pardon me for burdening you with these details, but I suppose I am like your boys who say, the colonel was always as ready to listen to a private as to a major general. Wishing you and yours the very best gifts the season can bring. And then he ends the book with this sentence: is it any wonder that I loved my regiment? Almost brings me to tears. Is it any wonder that I loved my regiment? Men who fought, trained, died, bled, sweat, sacrificed together, unified by that spirit that I was talking about. And I'm going to go back to this Roosevelt biography by Edmund Morris real quick for 2 notes because it's in the same vein. This says admiration. Roosevelt asked the men to come forward. He shook all their hands when they left Montauk. Asked the men to come forward and shake his hand. I want to say goodbye to each one of you in person. Company ranks were formed, and the Rough Riders began to pass by their colonel in single file. Many cried openly as they walked away. He was the only man I ever came in contact with, confessed one private, that when bidding farewell, I felt a handshake was but poor expression. I wanted to hug him. Roosevelt had a compliment, joke, recognition, or a ready identification for every man. So he knew every single man in his regiment. He knew them well enough to recognize them, to make a joke, to pay a compliment, to give them some sort of individual and unique recognition. Powerful. He goes on to say to one of his buddies, Jacob Reese, so all things pass away, but they were beautiful days. Fighting, putting yourself on the line, completing your duty in the face of immense danger. He described them as beautiful days. And that, to me, is one of the greatest stories of American soldiering, or just the American. It's one of the greatest representations of the American spirit that I can think of. These men were volunteers from all over the country, very little in common by way of experience, circumstance, and things like that, for the most part. They came together so that they could fight the enemies of our nation, that they could keep the beacon of American freedom aflame, that the world might see it, that their families might see it, that they might be able to live in freedom. And many of them died. Most of them were injured, and all of them sacrificed greatly because of their unifying and common spirit. So that's the Rough Riders. You can get the book using the link in the description if you want. No cost to you. It's an Amazon affiliate link. It's a really short book written by Teddy Roosevelt himself, which is cool because you get to have an idea. Like, you're actually like basically hearing him talk, which is very cool. One of my favorite things about autobiographies and books that are firsthand accounts of people that were there. And I want to remind you again, that is the spirit with which we hope you walk through life and live your life wearing Rough Rider. I hope that the spirit that you get, the emboldened spirit that you get from wearing a Rough Rider shirt or any of the things that will come out with in the future, that's the spirit that I hope and that we hope that you live with. I hope that it's an ode. It's like I hope that you can draw from the men in the Rough Rider Regiment, draw some of their characteristics, their traits, their leadership, their fearlessness, their courage, their self-reliance, their duty, and their hardiness in your own life. That's where I'll let it go for now. RoughRiderUSA.co. RoughRiderUSA.co today, Monday, February 17th at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Until next time, onward and upward.